Last year, the federal government launched a series of regional roundtables or consultations with provinces and stakeholders around energy and resources. And yesterday, the BC component of that reported and has a new diversification vision, energy and clean energy vision for the province. And I'm going to talk to Mark Zacharias, the Executive Director of Clean Energy Canada, about what he thinks about that new vision. So welcome to the interview, Mark.
Great. Thanks, Markham, for having me.
Well, this is really fascinating because I know that, behind the scenes, there have been some very difficult conversations going on. For instance, Alberta still has not agreed to a roundtable with the federal government. They're still squabbling, and a couple of other provinces are not a lot of progress has been made. But BC seems to have embraced this process more than any other province. And maybe just could you give us a little overview of how that process worked?
As you said, this is a fairly new initiative over the last year or so, and I think the focus has been on BC from the federal government and Atlantic Canada, looking to advance the Atlantic Loop in terms of getting their provinces off of coal generation. And, BC, I think correctly in the BC government and in the First Nations Leadership Council saw this as an opportunity to unlock federal funding and have it come BC's way in helping BC transition to a low carbon economy and also set BC up to be more competitiveness over the coming decades.
I have to say, I mean, you and I have talked a few times about BC's Clean BC, BC's climate plan, some of the other programs that have come out around clean energy. And while there have been some criticisms of BC's strategy, particularly around BC Hydro's electrification plans and load growth plans, I'd have to say, based on the blizzard of announcements that come into my inbox from the BC government on a regular basis, the province is really getting into the meat of the strategy, into the meat of these policies, whether it be building codes, whether it be Indigenous renewable energy projects. There's a lot of work going on, and it makes sense, I think, that this framework agreement, cooperation agreement between the federal government, the BC government, and Indigenous nations, it just seems to be the timing is right.
Fully agree. No one's come out and said it, but essentially this tripartite agreement between the Leadership Council, the federal government, the provincial government is indeed an industrial strategy for the next couple of decades. And I think people are going to start realizing over the coming weeks and months that this is actually a fairly important marker on the table for BC's future economy.
Let's go through some of the opportunity areas that are identified in the announcement. The first one that jumps out is critical minerals. And this is many provinces, Quebec, Alberta, Saskatchewan have all said they want to be in on the critical minerals. And many of them have strategies, but they're not very advanced. But it seems like BC is really jumping in with both feet here.
Yeah, and we have yet to see BC's critical mineral strategy, and I think they're taking a bit longer to work with Indigenous nations to make sure they get it right. But I think BC is quite correctly realized that it has a lot of the metals and minerals that are going to be required. It also has the capacity and the workforce to be able to refine some of those metals, whether it's into kind of battery metals or some value add before they go to market. So yeah, I think it's quite good to see BC start thinking more critically around what its opportunity and again, where is its kind of value and return on investment.
Yeah, I think the refining part of this, the processing of critical minerals into battery metals like lithium oxide and the various other components. China currently controls 80% of global refining capacity for battery metals, and with the Americans essentially declaring that they're going to build a North American EV industry and battery industry with domestic supply chains, like North American supply chains. It's the first one to get into this, first province that really goes after the refining in a big way. Seems like it'd have a huge first mover advantage.
Oh, absolutely. And Ontario and Quebec are already kind of starting to have announcements around battery metals processing in terms of new investments in their jurisdictions. And there's no reason BC can't also be part of it. again, and we sometimes forget, but Teslas are built in California, and we do have a lot of automotive markets that are one boat ride away from Vancouver or Prince Rupert.
Exactly right. Well, let's talk about electrification now. And BC Hydro brought out its new load forecast not too long ago. And it's funny, prior to the big downturn, global downturn in 2007, 2009, BC Hydro was forecasting 2% growth. And then it went flat for more than a decade. Now they're back to forecasting 2% load growth again. So it seems like the utility is expecting that electric vehicles and heat pumps and electric industrial processes is going to significantly increase the demand for electricity within the province.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at every one of BC Hydro's kind of forecasts over the last decade, decade and a half, even the most ambitious scenario is conservative in hindsight. And what we're seeing now is uptake on EVs, heat pumps, electrification of industrial processes. That's just accelerated to a degree that surprised all of us. And it's really nice to see the BC government and BC Hydro, acknowledge that we're going to need some more power and then go out to market. We'll see the call appear, I think, early next year for 3,000 gigawatt hours, which is equivalent to about 2/3 of what Site C would produce. And then do that in partnership with Indigenous nations as equity partners. So I think what Hydro and what government are doing is the right path.
The next one we want to talk about is clean fuels and hydrogen. Of course, BC, in particular Vancouver, has been a hub for the development on the hydrogen demand side. So we have Ballard Fuel Cells and Hydro Engineering, and there's a whole host of companies. In fact, for viewers, we have a hydrogen playlist on our YouTube channel, and I've interviewed many of the hydrogen companies in Vancouver. So if you're looking for some background, you can find it there. So it's what are the parties to this agreement envisioning in this space, Mark?
I think it's all things clean hydrogen. And I think BC correctly is taking a view that, how the hydrogen is produced, whether it's from natural gas, where the carbon is sequestered underground, or whether it's from electricity using water and creating green hydrogen through electrolyzers. Really what's important is the carbon intensity. And I think also what jurisdictions like BC are starting to realize is that you not only have to spur the supply of hydrogen in terms of tax credits and investments, but also you need to create the demand side of it. And whether that is going to be new rules requiring medium and heavy duty vehicles to be zero emission, whether it's going to be requiring the natural gas utilities like Fortis to have a percentage of their production to be renewable. So all of those are in play right now. The policy is being developed. So as you say, BC has a world-class natural gas resource that could be used to create blue hydrogen. We have abundant clean energy opportunities here that could be stood up to create green hydrogen. So the future is really still unclear on hydrogen, but I think BC will be a player.
One of the things that in hydrogen interviews, and again, viewers can go to the Energy Talks podcast and you can listen to my interview with Michael Lieberg, who's the founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, explain the problems with long-term hydrogen transportation. The volumetric gravity of it the physics don't work very well for long-term. So is the emerging strategy here, Mark, to focus on basically produce it where you use it, as opposed to thinking about overseas markets?
I think it's probably a bit of both. As you note, you can convert hydrogen to ammonia and then ship it around the world, which happens right now because ammonia is fertilizer. And you lose about 1/3 of the energy, doing the conversion, which is similar to creating LNG. So in terms of losses. So I think what you'll see here is you're going to see a hydrogen industry, a clean hydrogen industry that is going to be geared for export, mainly through ammonia, and mainly into markets that are going to use it to generate electricity or use it for fertilizer production. We also may see hydrogen production in Alberta and BC that's used domestically in agriculture as well, or it's used as an industrial feedstock. So when you create cement, when you create steel, right now you use natural gas as both the heat source and the feedstock, and you can swap hydrogen for both of those. So there's lots of opportunities here.
Well, let's talk about carbon management now. And this is about, I understand, developing a regional approach to support competitive clean energy and resource sectors. And this smacks, if I'm reading between the lines correctly, Mark, what we're seeing here is the BC government and the Indigenous nations agreeing with the federal government that industrial strategy and policy is at the core of this approach, and they need to do that in collaboration with the government partners, with industry partners and other stakeholders around how to manage carbon, how to lower emissions. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I think so. And really it's nascent technology and nascent businesses that are starting up in a lot of this carbon management space. What we're realizing in BC is that we have far better geology than we ever thought in terms of, for example, putting and storing carbon underground. Not just disused natural gas reservoirs, but serpentine formations across the province. We've got startups, like Carbon Engineering, looking at how do we use electricity to kind of pull carbon out of the air and either store it under the ground, create fuels, or turn it into a solid project. We've got pyrolysis companies looking at, how do we take fossil fuels or biomass and, pull the carbon out of it and store it in solid form. So I think again, it's something that's going to be absolutely required over the coming decades to kind of reduce the world's carbon footprint, but it's not really clear quite yet kind of where BC will play in that space.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But at least they're grappling with it, and there are very few other provincial governments that I can see. Maybe Quebec, but I'm not that familiar with it. But very few others that have even got to this point. If it's nascent in BC, it's dormant or hasn't sprouted yet in other provinces. Does that give BC again a first mover advantage?
It may. I think yet to be seen. And what's really driving the interest in carbon management in BC is BC's had a succession of fairly stringent climate plans with tight climate targets. And if you are going to have more industry, more business, more population, more growth, more economic activity, you need to figure out, like, what are you going to do with the emissions that those create? And then how do you do that? And how do you have all that without blowing past your climate targets? And carbon removal and carbon management are definitely going to be part of the solution.
Well, let's talk about the last one, regulatory efficiency, because when I interview experts in the United States or Europe, even Asia Pacific, these days, regulatory frameworks and the policy that drives those regulatory frameworks is identified as one of the top three things that are propelling the clean energy economy forward, both the production of clean energy and the manufacturing of clean energy industry that supplies and the supply chains that feed into that. So what kind of regulatory efficiency might we be looking at in British Columbia that supports all of that process?
Well, I think the BC government has been thinking about this, and BC has been ahead of Canada in terms of working with the federal government on regulatory efficiencies. For example, BC had the first substitution agreement with the federal government, so you do one environmental assessment for both levels of government. I think BC is now very much involved in having kind of Indigenous nations involved in all aspects of regulatory processes. So at the end of the day, we've seen projects like wood fiber LNG, whether there was a separate decision by the Squamish Nation to approve the project. So having said that, though, there still is a lot of overlap and duplication in all of these processes. Often you'll go through an environmental assessment only to really have to redo the project through the permitting. And so BC is looking at things like concurrent permitting. So your permitting flows along with your environmental assessment, and you do that in conjunction with federal, local, and Indigenous governments. And at the end of the day, hopefully you should see some timelines get a lot shorter. A lot of work to do in this space. Unclear as yet as to when we will start to see expedited regulatory processes, but hoping in the next year or so that we'll have some clearer understanding of what it's going to look like.
Just to wrap up our conversation, Mark, what are your thoughts on the likelihood of the BC Canadian agreement, and especially in the fact that it incorporates Indigenous communities, but is serving as a model? Because we've had this kind of logjam where a lot of the provincial governments, and I'm looking at you, Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular, but they've let their politics of fighting with Ottawa all the time get in the way of doing this kind of a process. And it seems like if Canada is going to be competitive in a low carbon economy, and particularly as supply chains evolve for the rest of this decade, that the process that was announced yesterday needs to be done across the country. And time is of the essence. I mean, we can't dawdle on this stuff. The world is changing right before our very eyes in real time. It's amazing how fast things are going. And BC seems to get it. And how do we then, communicate that urgency to the rest of Canada?
Well, I mean, the RERTs, or Regional Economic and Resource Table, that we've just kind of seen announced yesterday in BC, that seemed to be a model that works well and is naturally aligned with how BC thinks and works, and also too with Indigenous groups, feeling that that's the right venue to have the conversation in. I'm not sure whether that's the right template for all areas across Canada, but I think the federal government knows that, and my sense is they are reasonably far along in terms of the same model for the Atlantic provinces. Again, looking at sort of different aspects of the economy and decarbonization and maintaining affordability. So I'm hopeful that that will happen. And again, BC is a little bit different than, for example, the relationship between Ottawa and the Ontario government. Because they're geographically co-located, a lot of these deals get swung to bring in new industries and new sectors, new manufacturing outside of processes like the one we saw in BC, just because there's a lot more back and forth and a lot more idea generation, and a lot of the politicians kind of co-locate in ridings in Ontario and Quebec. So, the BC table, I think, was needed, and it was the right model for BC to get this agreement done. Will there be different sort of flavors of this across Canada over the coming months and years? Probably there will be, although it's hard to say.
Right. Fair enough. Well, Mark, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.